Before we get into the nuts and bolts of diagramming, I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing when we diagram and why. This is part of that strategy of metacognition that I talked about in the video on self-assessment. I just want you to have a sense of why we diagram, and that's going to help inform how you diagram. Right off the bat, I want to change how you think about logic games in terms of diagramming. And instead of diagramming types of games, I'd like you to think more about diagramming information. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You're thinking diagramming games, information, it's all the same thing. Well, yes and no. A lot of the time when we talk about diagramming types of games, we're talking about diagramming linear games or hybrid games or grouping games, and that's perfectly fine. But the difficulty with that strategy is that you become attached to diagramming things a certain way, and you become attached to thinking about diagramming games rather than focusing on diagramming the information that's provided to you. It also means that when a game doesn't conform to the way you've learned to diagram it, or when a game doesn't fit easily into those categories, or more recently, the game just doesn't have that kind of diagram, then there's a tendency to get confused, there's a tendency to panic, and once you do that, it really gets hard to stay on task. So I want you to resist the idea that you're diagramming a type of game. Focus instead on providing a visual representation of information. What do I mean? I mean, logic games encompass a set of finite logical relationships, and it's usually gathered within a pretty artificial scenario. This isn't like something you're going to encounter in real life. And the content of that game or the scenario of that game, that's not really what's most important about it. What's most important are the logical relationships that that game lays out. And it's those logical relationships that you're going to use to create your diagram and to solve the problems and questions that you encounter. So when you diagram, what you're looking to do is diagram that set of finite logical relationships. And the easiest way to do that is visually. It becomes much easier to see the logical relationships that the game has given you if you're diagramming those relationships rather than writing them out or reading them. And the essential key is to diagram those relationships. So I'd like you to start thinking about diagrams as a way of visually representing information, not as a way of diagramming types of games. Because when you're focused on visualizing information, you're not going to be distracted, put off, or confused if the game doesn't conform to what you've learned to do. Because all logic games are going to use the same types of relationships. Again, there's only a finite number of relationships possible, and the LSAT restricts itself to only two types of relationships, ordering on the one hand and assigning on the other hand. So there's only so many types of information that they can present. And if you stay dialed in on visually representing information and logical relationships, it'll help you look past the type of game and really focus on what you need to have in order to solve the questions. Your goal is to get the right answer as quickly and as efficiently as you possibly can. And the reason we diagram is to visualize those logical relationships that will allow you to do that. But this also means something else, and it's initially difficult for my clients to believe that this is true, but it bears itself out for them over time. If you're struggling with inferences, if you're struggling to find those connections that will help you answer the questions, then I think that 9 times out of 10, the problem there is your diagram. What I've seen over and over again is that when my students struggle later in the game, when they struggle with inferences and finding connections, usually those problems can be traced back to their diagram. It's very rare that someone just somehow can't draw inferences or can't find connections, because after all, finding inferences, drawing inferences, you do this on a daily basis. This is part of just the general furniture of your thinking every day. The only thing that changes on the LSAT is this artificially restricted set of logical relationships. And I don't think the issue has to do with someone's intellect or their ability to see those relationships. I think what it really has to do with is how well you've constructed that information in a visual form to allow you to draw further connections. All right, so focus on diagramming the information and the logical relationships. Do not focus so much on diagramming the type of game. And in the next video, we're going to talk about the features of a good diagram. And then we're going to look at some specific games and concepts. So have fun and keep watching.